Hi, I'm Reverend Jake Sabe, and welcome to Children's Bible Stories. Alright children, our Bible story for today is going to be the story of Jesus calling his first disciples. Now, for those who have watched most of the videos on this channel, you know that one of the earliest videos we did was Jesus calling his disciples again. And the reason we said that is because this story from John's Gospel is when Jesus called his disciples the first time, and the stories in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark is actually Jesus calling his disciples a second time. He's recalling his disciples. And we know this because in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, when Jesus calls his four disciples, Andrew, Peter, James, and John, Jesus calls them after he has already performed a number of miracles. Yet we read in the second chapter of John's Gospel that the very first miracle Jesus ever did was the miracle of turning water into wine at the wedding of Cana. And Jesus had already called 6 of his disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, and Nathaniel, in John chapter 1 before he went to the wedding of Cana. Therefore, the account in John's Gospel is the account in which Jesus called these disciples the first time, and the account in Matthew and Mark where Jesus calls Peter, Andrew, James, and John while they're fishing or fixing their nets, that account is actually a recalling, a second time that these disciples were called. And so in this video, we're going to focus on the first time that Jesus called his first 4 disciples. Jesus had been in the wilderness 40 days being tempted by Satan. But after that, Jesus returned to the area near Jerusalem where John was baptizing. And John tells his disciples who were listening to him how this was the one that John had been preaching about, whose sandals John was not fit to untie, and how Jesus had come before him and how Jesus was greater than him. Then John's Gospel tells us that the next day Jesus came walking along again, and John spotted him again and said, "Look, behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." And at this point in time, 2 of John's disciples decided to go after Jesus, since he was the Messiah, the Lamb of God. And the text doesn't tell us exactly who these 2 disciples were. The text tells us that there was one disciple named Andrew, and the other disciple was simply mentioned as another disciple, one who wasn't named. Now, John is the one writing this gospel, and he often refers to himself as the beloved disciple. And so many scholars believe that this unnamed disciple is John, who out of humility doesn't want to name himself. And Andrew, and who we believe is John, they start to follow Jesus. And so these 2 disciples started following Jesus, and he turned to them and said, "What do you seek?" And they said, "Rabbi, where are you staying?" And he said, "Come and see." And so they went to the house that Jesus was staying in that night, but just as it was getting late, Andrew ran off and found his brother Peter. Now the text doesn't mention James anywhere in this text, but we know that James is often alongside the other disciples, being one of the top 3 disciples, and so it's possible that while Andrew went to go get Peter, that John went and got James. What is interesting about that is that John and Andrew are both the younger brothers, and Peter and James are the older brothers. So their younger brothers ran off to go get their older brothers to come see Jesus. And the text tells us that Andrew ran and said, "Come and see. We have found the Messiah." What is most interesting about this statement is that many people are familiar with St. Peter's confession when Jesus asked him, "Who do you say the Messiah is?" And Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." But long before Peter ever made that confession, his younger brother Andrew had said, "We have found the Messiah." So even before Peter believed that Jesus was the Messiah, Andrew had already believed that Jesus was the Messiah. And at this, Peter came with Andrew, and Jesus came to his 4 disciples. And Jesus then said to Peter, or his name was Simon, to be exact, Jesus said to him, "Simon, son of Jonah, you shall be called Peter." And so Peter is the name that Jesus gave to Simon. His name was Simon, but Jesus called him Peter, which meant rock, because Peter would have a rock-solid faith. And that then, children, is the story of Jesus calling his first few disciples. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Sable. Goodbye and God bless.